Okay, hello, welcome to Unit 3. This is about a 10-minute video that deals with a couple things. First of all, I try to emphasize a few points that don't really come up in the textbook as well as I would like. And secondly, and most importantly, this little video is to help you get through one of your assignments, the assignment about critiquing surveys. So let's get started. More than ever before, we as media consumers are being called on to evaluate survey research as well as all sorts of scientific research. And the lessons from this class and this presentation really are important lessons for just a media consumer. For example, we're presented with surveys in the news that give us conflicting results, and we are left to try to sort out what the truth is, what is correct, rather than in the past when perhaps journalists took a more active role in doing such things. In addition, a lot of science and a lot of polling is up for political debate, and especially now in the political campaign. So a respected polling firm like Gallup or Roper or the New York Times releases the results of their polls, and more than ever before, their methods, their background, their political beliefs, everything is challenged. And we are left as the media consumer sort of wondering what to believe. So it really becomes more and more incumbent on us to be good at assessing polling results and assessing survey research. So this is a cartoon from PhD Comics, which you can see online, but it makes a couple really good points. Point number one, that if polls with differences that are within the margin of error are discussed as if they're actual differences. So for example, if one candidate is ahead of another candidate by 2 percentage points, but the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, they are ostensibly the same. But you will see journalists deal with this incorrectly all the time. Item number two here, that polls are conducted of scientific issues, as if we could all of us could vote on the truthfulness about things such as global warming or evolution or any number of other things. The third thing here, that polls are done with bad samples and they're reported. And this happens all the time in broadcast news and all the time online. There'll be call-in polls or something like this to see whether you like the president's new thing or whether you like a particular move by Congress or something like that. These polls are worthless, but they provide fodder for journalists, and so they get given greater credence, greater credibility. And finally, the last item here on this little comic is that we always have to think to ourselves, one, whether people actually have an opinion about something they're being asked. So today now, here in January 2016, we have a new treaty with Iran. And if we were to ask people, what do you think about the treaty with Iran? I think the truthful answer for most people is, I don't know anything about it, or they know very little about it. But they will respond to that question, and what we're probably getting is their dislike for the president. They say they dislike the treaty. What they're really saying is they dislike Obama, but truthfully, they know nothing about the treaty. So what would be someone's actual response if we let them say, I don't know, or I don't care? And that's often something that's really important to consider. So let me give you an example that will let us go through various points that you can use in trying to critique a survey for the assignment. So at the height of the debate surrounding the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, about 3 years ago, two surveys of doctors were released to the public within the same week, within just days of each other. But they offered very different assessments of what doctors in the United States thought about the proposed Affordable Care Act. The act, of course, was passed and is generally known as Obamacare and is active today. So one survey, the survey at top here, found that doctors generally supported provisions of the law. The bottom survey found that doctors generally opposed those same provisions. So how could this happen? How could you get two surveys that give you diametrically opposed results of the same population? And what do we do? I'm reading this newspaper. What am I to think about this? So here are some things that we might look at in assessing any survey to try to determine whether it is good data or bad. Okay, so the first thing you want to consider is the sponsorship. Consider the source, as they say. The first survey was sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. both of which I think are very credible. One, a credible research institution, and then the other, a very credible medical journal. The second survey was conducted for a media outlet called Investors Business Daily, and was done by a research firm called Technometrica. Now, that doesn't automatically mean you should reject the data. Lots of good data comes from interesting sources. But this is one little bit of information we want to take into account as we go about trying to assess the overall credibility of the survey. Where did it come from? If a Democratic candidate puts out a survey that supports Democratic ideas, you might be a little suspect. Likewise, with a Republican survey that comes out supporting their ideas. So next, examine the question text. This is really important, and this is something, of course, we spend a lot of time with this week. Take a look, if you haven't already, at the short video I posted from the BBC on Engage. It's really nice. Question wording matters, and we have to look closely at what the question wording was for any particular survey. And we also have to look and see whether people were given the option to say, "I don't know" or "I don't care." So, at the top of this slide shows you, under number 1, the verbatim text of the question that was posed. It's not a great question. It's a long, wordy question. But there it is, and you can pause the video and take a look at it for yourself. For the survey on the bottom, the survey research firm did not provide the wording for the question. What they did is they paraphrased it, and they said physicians were asked, "Do you support or oppose the proposed plan?" That is important, and that's a black mark against the believability of this survey. Look at the verbatim question text, and then say to yourself whether you agree that the response to this question is what it's been interpreted, or what the claim of the interpretation is. Question wording is really key, and good, reputable surveys report their question wording. All right, take a look at the sample frame and the sampling. This is really important. So for the first survey up above, this data came from the American Medical Association Physician Master File. So when you become a physician, apparently and join the AMA, I guess, your name goes into their master file. They then drew a random sample of all the physicians in the 50 states. They excluded doctors in training, so doctors who were in residencies or internships were not included. Okay, so that's how they drew their sample. The sample on the bottom was purchased from a list broker. Now that does not necessarily mean it's a bad sample. You can go to list brokers in the United States and purchase lists of people from all sorts of occupations, all sorts of demographic backgrounds. If you want to get a list of millionaires who own property in Florida, you can probably get such a list, and if you wanted to poll them about something, you can do so. But here are the two sample frames that were used here. Okay, let's take a look at the type of survey. In both cases, these surveys were done by mail. Now, you will encounter people once in a while who say, "Oh, the only good surveys are done by phone." And that is not true in any stretch at all. If you work for an organization, an advocacy group or something, for example, you can do outstanding surveys by mail or over the internet, and you can get high response rates and get very good data. So whether or not a particular method is appropriate depends on what you're trying to do. And these researchers know that to get doctors to respond to surveys, you have to let them do them online or by mail. You just can't get doctors on the phone. They're too busy. But you can get them to complete surveys online, etc. I spoke to someone some time ago who surveyed doctors, and they said that they used internet surveys. They paid the doctors to participate, and they said on average most of the doctors completed the surveys between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. and that is at the end of a long day. The doctor's been working all day. They finally log in and complete the survey. That's when they could find the time to do it. All right, so then let's also look at the response rate. You have to identify response rate in your assignment this week. It's critical that you understand what this is, and you have to identify it absolutely correctly, or you will not get the points. So for the first example, the response rate was 43.2%, and then they state this is typical of most recent national physician surveys. That appears to be true. They do something else then. They look at the demographics of the 43% who responded, and they compare those demographics to the demographics of the sampling frame. And they could look across specialty, practice, and location to see if there was any systematic difference. In other words, if a lot of the respondents came from one part of the country or from one specialty, etc. And they did not. The proportions in the sample matched the proportions in the sampling frame. That gives us some greater confidence that we have a pretty good sample here. For the second survey, the response rate was about 6%. Now, for surveys that are reported in politics, response rates today might be between 5% and 20 or 25%. I think today 25% would be considered really good. Response rates have been on a slow, steady decline overall for the past 30 years. We don't respond to surveys like we used to for all sorts of interesting reasons. So if CBS News comes out with a survey and they have a 20% response rate, that's about what you should expect. On the other hand, if you're surveying a group of people who attend your organization, who belong to your organization, you might get response rates of 60, 70, 80%. It just depends. 43% strikes me as quite good. And as they say, it measures up well with other similar surveys. So these are things you should consider, along with many other things, but here are some things that you might look at in trying to assess whether these surveys are reputable, whether you should believe what they're telling you. Sponsorship, question wording, the sampling frame, the sampling method, and the sample size, the type of survey, and the response rate. And then we come back to the original question. Who do you believe? Who are you more likely to believe? And I will tell you that I'm inclined to believe that at this point in time, more doctors generally liked the provisions of the Affordable Care Act than disliked it. And I think the evidence suggests that. Yet you can do a survey, as the people in the second category demonstrate, that shows you something else. What's really important here as well is that we recognize that you have to accept all the data that's in front of you, and you will see a lot of this now in the presidential election. So for example, you will see candidates from one side or the other believing those polls that agree with them and denying the truthfulness of those polls that do not agree with them. And as researchers, we have to get away from this. We have to try to evaluate all evidence as best we can on some sort of objective standards, and not simply believe those things that are in agreement with what we already believe. That's the great challenge, and a lot of very smart people fall into that trap. They don't believe evidence that runs contrary to what they think is true. And one of the lessons of a class like this, and one of the lessons of learning something about research methods, is that we have to accept all the evidence out there and consider the full weight of it before we decide what we think is true. So I hope this little presentation helps you a bit with your assignment and helps with a little bit with some advice, and I wish you the best of luck, and I will see you online.